Right. I think we can start. Hello and welcome to today's online discussion on Europe's moment, Franco-German action in the wake of an eroding global order. Today is the final event of our Pariser Platz Dialogue series, which is our Franco-German dialogue series, very kindly supported by the Federal Foreign Office. And just last week, we met with 145 guests from France, Germany, and beyond at the Pariser Platz in Berlin to explore some of Europe's most pressing issues today, from industrial policy and the new MFF to geopolitics and defense, digital sovereignty, and coalitions of the willing as a means to overcome political deadlock. And today's online discussion will converge some of these topics, always with the overarching question of how France and Germany can lead the way in addressing the unprecedented convergence of threats that Europe is currently facing. I am Tu Nguyen, Acting Director of the Jack Loss Center in Berlin, and I am very happy to moderate this excellent panel today with Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, Shaheen Vallet, Senior Associate Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Georgina Wright, Special Advisor to the President and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Hello, Daniela, Shaheen, and Georgina.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Very good to have you. I would like to start with sort of a broader picture question on where we stand, on where Europe stands. So the EU is facing multiple threats at once: Russia's war of aggression, a second China shock, and shifting dynamics in the US, not only in the transatlantic relationship, with the new national security strategy just being the latest evidence, but also in the shift away from state power to big tech and big tech influence on state powers. And even one of these issues by itself is quite a big challenge. Now we have all three converging. Is the EU equipped to address all three threats simultaneously? And Daniela, perhaps you would like to start.
Well, thank you first of all, for having me, and then also for laying out the land in the way you did, because I indeed think that the European Union is facing quite existential threats to the way it is organized and the way it has managed itself in the world, because what we are observing are global changes which challenge, together with other developments, three dimensions of European order. One is the security order, and you mentioned Russia's war against Ukraine, but also the China dimension has a security element. So there's this big topic. Then the economic order is really under challenge, because the old assumptions that Europe is embedded into a globalizing world economy where Europe has a competitive edge and can successfully deal with other major markets and run a surplus in doing that. This is also now really strongly challenged, both by US protective measures and also by, first of all, Chinese protectionism, but also Chinese overproduction and its competitive gains. So in terms of thinking about our economic model, Europe is also under a major threat. And the third element was really again emphasized with the US national security strategy published last week. Our democratic model of governance is also under threat, both within, because we see a rise of non-democratic actors, and from externally through very clear interventions in our democratic spheres. Now, Europe can deal with those threats and challenges, but I believe it has to do much better than it has shown over the past month. We see an acceleration of certain policies and also new policies kind of put to the forefront, which weren't in the initial 5-year outlook of the European Commission. Quick moves now on critical minerals, more measures on economic security. I hope measures to deepen the European financial market, because if we don't manage to protect and make our economy more competitive, we will not be able to protect ourselves. We won't be able to gain tech sovereignty. And at the end of the day, that will also be detrimental to our democracy, because socio-economic policy in member states remains crucial to give people the impression that they are well put into democratic systems and open societies.
Thank you, Daniela. And I want to zoom in into these economic challenges, but also security challenges and tech challenges a bit later. Shaheen, can Europe do what Daniela says that Europe needs to do? Is it capable of acting on so many fronts at once?
I think it is entirely capable of doing so, but it is held back by a couple of things. One is two sets of pretty extraordinary dependencies. A dependency for its own security on the US, which continues to hold back Europe from maybe mounting a more muscular response to the US's trade policy against the EU, for instance. And I think the fact that Europe is so heavily dependent on the US for the purpose of defending Ukraine, for instance, is a critical vulnerability that I think explains a lot the European complacency. The other is an extreme dependency on China, and a dependency on China that is accelerating. And it used to be an export dependency, in particular of Germany. And that export dependency is now turning into what you have called a second China shock. And I think that second China shock cannot be underestimated. I think Europe in general and Germany in particular has downplayed its importance. And I think there is a very acute need now of a radical change in economic policy to respond to it. It's quite striking when you think about it that a year and a half ago, when the EU embarked on imposing new tariffs on electric vehicles, the German government abstained on that decision. And it abstained on what is perhaps the most important economic policy decision that the EU took for the purpose of Germany and the German industrial sector. It abstained because it was internally divided. And it was internally divided because also the German car industry and the industrial sector and on the whole was unclear about what to do. I think there was at the time a strong fear by the car industry lobby that if we were to impose European tariffs on Chinese vehicles, the German car sector, which had invested so heavily in China, would be treated as a Chinese car maker in Europe and as a European car maker in China, and potentially losing on both fronts. I have the impression that thinking in Germany is evolving slowly, but it has not yet turned into a new policy, which I think needs to be rooted in higher tariffs on Chinese goods, where the EU believes that it can compete and where it must, for national security reasons, maintain some domestic production capacity. And I think the auto sector is probably one of them. And the other is combine that with a buy European preference, or basically another way of saying it is a European industrial policy. I think these are words that a few months ago were very much taboo across Europe, potentially even more so in Germany. I think they remain taboo in still some parts of Brussels. I think, talking about industrial policy with DG Trade or DG Comp remains something that is quite difficult. But I think this is changing fast. So, the EU was about to introduce actually today, which we could have talked about, the EU Industrial Accelerating Act. This has been postponed to late January. But so I think there is some movement. But I think that's very necessary. The reason why this is difficult too is because it's difficult, and we have experienced it when we were trying to devise a European response to the Inflation Reduction Act. It's difficult to devise a true European industrial policy when we only have national fiscal resources to do that. And that was the big problem with the IRA. We ended up not having a European response to the IRA, but rather a set of national responses that were enabled by a weakening of the state aid framework. I think the question now is, can we do better with the European, Industry Acceleration Act? I think that's the big question. And I think it takes us back to, the perennial question of Europe's fiscal integration. Can we put together European fiscal resources to devise a new economic policy? I think that's the fundamental challenge for Europe. I think it can definitely overcome these obstacles, but my fear is that it may not be able to overcome these obstacles nearly fast enough. I think the speed of the economic shock that is hitting us is astounding, and sadly, the speed of our reaction does not match. And so I think that's the big challenge for us, to basically accelerate our change of tack so that we can mount an effective response. But maybe we can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A.
Yes, and I think also in second block, before we get to that, Georgina, Shaheen says Europe is too slow. We are not acting in the speed that we need to match the speed of the challenges thrown at us. And as global norms and principles erode, what does it take for the EU to not just survive, but really be able to shape global developments and uphold its own values? Someone at Pariser Platz suggested that perhaps the times are gone when the EU was able to impose its own standards, also when it comes to trade agreements, for example. Do you agree?
Easy question, thank you. And I'm just about to say I'm in broad agreement with the two speakers, because which is never good on a panel, and I'm sure there will be disagreement further down the line, but completely agree on the diagnosis. To answer your question simply, I think we're living through a moment where these norms are no longer taken for granted, even inside the EU. They're certainly not taken for granted if you look at the United States and China, but they're even being debated inside the EU. And I think that those are hard conversations. There's a lot of reckoning to be had. When you talk to senior Democrats in the US, they say, we don't get it. Like, you've done the right diagnosis. You've got the Draghi report. You've got the Letter report. Why aren't you acting on it? Like, why are you so slow? So the point that Shaheen says, which is we're getting there, but we're just simply not able to act fast enough. I think that is majorly holding back the EU from influencing abroad. And I think also I hear a lot when I have conversations with diplomats from countries around the world, they feel that the EU has lost its confidence. And it's not surprising given all the challenges that Daniela set out, with the US and China, and then also politically, internally. But I think if you are not clear on what norms you're trying to defend, it's going to be very difficult to have those conversations. I think the EU really needs to have more conversations with like-minded partners and be much more willing to listen to what they want. Before there was this sense of almost normative grandeur, like we're right, we have high standards, everyone, we're going to bring everyone to the, and actually there are conversations that we can have with partners that don't share everything that we do, but actually are willing to deepen, trade of access to raw materials, if in return we can invest massively in their infrastructure. So I think having more of those conversations and listening to what they want is really necessary. And accept, and both Daniela and Shaheen said this, accept that the world is very different. So I think there's always a tendency in many parts of the EU to be like, oh, what we need is more Europe. But that's unpalatable to a lot of Europeans. They don't necessarily want Brussels to have more of a role. As Shaheen said, there's the complexity where you need EU-wide decisions, but actually member states decide, and they hold the fiscal purse. And I was quite encouraged by the recent EU's economic security strategy, which actually put forward really concrete ways of creating an agency or a body where you could have national regulators or representatives of national ministries of the economy and finance to exchange intelligence and best practice. I think that's a good way of it's like a stepping stone, but I think it's better than sort of automatically advocating for let's abandon member state decisions and let's just decide everything at the EU level. Also, I think very practically, we are in a radically different environment, and that forces us to revisit, as Shane said, our competition rules, our trade rules, how we think about markets. And it requires deep ingrained expertise of what it is to have a supply chain, what it is to be an investor. And sometimes I worry that maybe even officials in EU departments and DGs perhaps are lacking that expertise, and that's no criticism of them. It's just the world is very different, and so then we need to find ways to have expert groups or maybe secondments to DGs from the business sector or think tanks. And then I think the leadership question is key. I really sense a leadership vacuum at the EU right now. I don't think von der Leyen is as strong as she used to be. France is obviously very weak domestically and completely consumed by domestic politics. Merz is, well, 2 Germans on the panel. I'm not going to speak for Germany, but it feels like we are veering to a point where decisions are going to be shaped by smaller groups of member states. That small group will depend on the issue, and they will shape the decision, then push it at the EU level. And I think we just need to accept that that's the direction we're going into. And I think that on some subjects, we're going to have to include non-EU voices as well as part of that conversation. It's deeply uncomfortable for all the reasons that we know, but I think it does require a change in approach if we really are going to respond quickly to the multiple challenges we face.
Thank you, Georgina. I think the question of coalitions of the willing or smaller groups of member states, I want to also revisit that later, because it was also one of these topics we discussed, but perhaps zooming into this question of the European economic model, because I think all 3 of you touched upon it. And you, Daniela, said it is at peril. Shaheen, you said we need more financial integration. There's a mismatch between where industrial policy is made and where the fiscal resources come. Perhaps a question to all 3 of you. So stuck between this Chinese overcapacity and a drop in US demand of tariffs, what would be the key measures that we need beyond those that you have mentioned, and can Germany and France play a role in advancing them? Daniela, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can give it a start, but I think we all 3 may want to comment. So I think we have to look at the short and the medium and long term. And in the short term, I think the term industrial policy is the right one, because we need to make sure that those industries which are strategic for Europe to have can survive in Europe. And I'm deliberately choosing that word because the pressure is so high that we risk losing core industry to other world regions. And bringing that back will be very, very hard. And we've seen it with the solar industry. Now, if wind leaves as well, we are very weak on renewables, which we are anyways. The chemical industry has huge problems, not to even speak of the car industry and the whole value chain behind the car producers. So I think there is a real moment of devising smart ways to support in the short term, but in the medium term, or for the medium term, we also need to take measures very quickly that allow new entrepreneurs to actually come into the market and build their business. So in Europe, we are not doing bad on patents. We are not doing bad on research and development, but translating research, if it is done in a university context, into marketable products is very difficult. So that means we have to now start building partnerships between research units, universities, and the private sector to enable them to think even of going into the economic sector with a startup or joining a larger existing corporate with an idea. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, financing in that context. And that is the problem we all know. Startups usually are able to fund themselves for the first, maybe the second round when they need to raise money, but then the third or fourth, when volumes get bigger and they need money faster because they have a momentum for growth, then they decide to go very often to the US and settle at the West Coast. Behind that lies a very big question of how we think about our financial markets, how we create the conditions that private capital is more mobile and can actually be invested in more risky endeavors, because we need to invest into risky endeavors in order to create economic growth and innovation. So here Europe clearly lags behind, and this is not just a question of passing a European law. It is about rethinking the way we have designed our pension systems, for instance, where in a country like Germany, billions of euros are stuck in investments which are really stable and safe, but do not contribute to economic growth and innovation. So I think I'll leave it there because the others will also have important things to say. But I think really we need to take immediate action, which are in a way more supportive, if not even protective, because we are facing unequal market conditions and not a level playing field. But then we need to act as quickly to create a new context, which will only be there in the medium term, so we can revive the economic fabric of the European Union in a very entrepreneurial way with much less of the state than we currently have. Thank you.
Thank you. Shaheen, would you like to add anything?
No, I think we're suffering a bit in Europe from an intellectual consensus that made industrial policy a bad word. And there was a good reason for that, is that when the single market was formed, it was formed on the ashes of national industrial policies that were indeed an obstacle to the integration of the single market. I think that mentality today, that industrial policy means necessarily a weakening of the single market, is something that we have to do away with, because it doesn't have to be the case. And I think this intellectual obstacle is really important to overcome. I don't think it has been overcome yet. There has been a very interesting non-paper at the initiative of the BMWE inside the German coalition that I think for the first time has accepted the notion of European preference, and which I think is kind of a very important contribution to the debate we're having and that the EU will be having about industrial policy. But interestingly enough, that acceptance is a very narrow acceptance only for the auto sector, when you could argue that actually it should apply, and I think this is the French view to a large extent, to a much broader set of sectors. Indeed, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that we would only apply this by European preference to the auto sector and not to batteries, for instance, because in fact, really an electric vehicle is mostly a battery on wheels more than anything else. So I think we have to think a bit more broadly with the upstream and downstream supply chains. I'm still struck today that we don't have a European approach to battery, for instance, and that is creating a very interesting and very profound breakdowns in the single market. For instance, if you look at 5 different battery plants in Sweden, Germany, France, Poland, what you will observe is that they each have very different levels of constraints on the FDI investor, in most cases China and sometimes Korea. Very different levels of environmental protection, very different levels of social workers protection, very different levels of clean energy input, and very different levels of government subsidies. The Hungarian case stands at one extreme with the highest level of subsidy and the lowest level of environmental protection. The Swedish example stands out as, the highest environmental standards, 100% clean energy, 100% domestic production, and the lowest level of public subsidy. Guess what happened? Sweden, the Northvolt factory failed. And it failed why? Because BMW canceled a $2 billion order for Northvolt batteries and placed the order instead with the Hungarian maker. So we basically have a policy that has destroyed the single market and that has created cannibalization between different battery plants in Europe. If we had had a European industrial policy, all of these plants would have survived with a fairly even amount of environmental protection, a fairly amount of investor protection also for foreign investors in these joint ventures. So I think we need to really accelerate that change of thinking. I'm encouraged that the EU, the Commission is moving in that direction. I'm, as I said earlier, worried that the transition in member states' mind is not fast enough.
Thank you. Georgina, would you like to comment on this?
I mean, very quickly, because I completely agree with what was said. I think private capital is key. I mean, if you look at defense startups in Europe, 50% of investment comes from the United States. And this is when we are in the middle of a debate on should we buy more European, should we focus on European production or, and it's insane to me that we are when we talk about this today, we're not doing it holistically, like Daniel has pointed out or Shaheen has pointed out. I think the internal barriers to the single market, which Shaheen has explained perfectly with the battery example, is another thing that we need to address quickly. And actually, when you ask industry, what's the problem? They don't really talk about, I mean, simplification. Yes, they'd like less paperwork. Yeah, that's clear. But actually, it would be much easier if they knew that doing business in Poland is exactly the same as doing business in France. And sometimes you have country, even within a country, it's different according to the region. So I think there's real things that we can do around that, real things about unlocking investment in European investment and making sure that European investment stays in Europe, because that's the other thing is that if you look at pension funds, some of them invest in the US because they think actually their money will go further, So there are practical things that we can do. And then I think in terms of inbound and outbound, but especially inbound investment screening is really key. So there is, over the last 2 years, I think there's been a real reckoning of China, but not only China, coming in, investing, becoming majority shareholder, taking over critical industries, and all of this happening, and then realizing, oh my goodness, we've lost something. We've not only lost job creation and a vital industry for European competitiveness, we've lost the race because they've absorbed the intellectual property, the research, and they're applying it abroad. So there is a lot again in that economic security strategy on how you address that and how you don't prevent investment from coming from abroad, but you do it in a way that contributes to EU competitiveness. And I think that's the third kind of pillar to the tripod of investment, capital investment, of reducing internal barriers to the single market and making sure that foreign direct investment is used in the best possible way for Europe.
Yeah. Thank you, Georgina. I want to switch topics a bit, but staying with you, Shaheen said that a lot of the things that happened this year and over the summer could be explained by Europe's dependence on the US when it comes to security and defense. And one question is, of course, with the shift in the transatlantic relationship, I will call it a shift, how can Europe ramp up its defense capacity without the US and without creating a deterrence gap during this transition? So how can we do both simultaneously, ramp up our defense ambitions, but not run into a lack of deterrence?
I mean, I think the French are happy in the... Sorry, did you want to jump in, Shane, or should I?
No, go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay, so I think the French are happy with the view that now we are talking about a move to a European-led security order, right? That's pretty evident because the United States has signaled for years, but has made it particularly acute in the last, with the publication of the National Security Strategy, although the people I speak to in Washington say you shouldn't just read that, you should read the triptych, right? There's going to be a national defense review, and then there's going to be a force posture review, and you've got to look at all three to understand the extent to which the US will be withdrawing troops and at what length, etc. But point being, in Europe, everyone has accepted that we need to move to European-led security order. I think ideally it would be a 70-30 burden shift. So you have Europeans leading on the political leadership. That also means Washington accepting to take a step back, which has not always been easy because sometimes they say they want Europeans to do more and then they're like, oh no, actually we really want to be part of the decision making. It also means taking on much more responsibility for conventional defense, but then also reducing your asks. I think ask little of the United States and do more is the perfect recipe to maintain interest and some form of presence of the US on the continent. And the US's responsibilities could be, of course, the nuclear deterrent, and then some capabilities that we simply cannot replace in the short term. And those are all sorts of things about, in surveillance, reconnaissance, and a number of precise strike precision capabilities. But you can actually create a list that's pretty short if you can show that you're meeting your defense commitments, you are increasing defense spending, and you are genuine about taking on more responsibility for your defense. On the defense procurements, like the defense industry side, that's much more complicated, because actually we need arms right now, and our industry say we can't produce, like we are producing, but we can't meet full delivery. So I think that you have to accept that we're going to need to purchase from abroad, at least in the short term. And then also there are increasing dependencies. So even the US defense industry, but European defense industry, we're dependent on critical raw materials coming in from China. Like it's not like as simple as saying we simply need to put more money on the table and we simply need to secure better supply chains and all will be okay. Same in terms of investment. A lot of the investment in our defense sector comes from the United States. And the US remains an important market for some of our biggest defense companies, like Rheinmetall has made it explicit that it wants to continue benefiting from the US. So I think more realism on those interdependencies and a more strategic and clear-eyed view of where those dependencies exist, and have a short, medium, and long-term plan to phase those out would be much more helpful than being locked into an endless debate about simply prioritizing European versus prioritizing European and the rest of the world.
Thank you. Shaheen, you wanted to come in before?
Yes, I think I have a more alarmist view of the situation. We've been effectively dealing with the war on European soil for almost 3 years now, almost 4 actually. And I think, the record of what we have done to gear up and put our defense industrial sector into a war economy mode is appalling. And I think France and Germany have a particular responsibility. The two countries that agreed actually before the war, two very important defense cooperation projects, one in building a new generation tank, and the other in building a new generation fighter jet program. Nobody wants to say it loudly and publicly, but the reality is that both of these projects are dying. There will not be a tank coming out of this project before there is one coming out from the factories of Rheinmetall. So I think that cooperation project has effectively lost its purpose. And there are such tensions between France and Germany on the fighter jet program that it's very likely that before the end of the year, the Chancellor will announce the withdrawal of Germany from the program. I mean, doing that in the middle of an historical conflict, I think, is a pretty damning outcome. I agree, however, with what Georgina has said, that I think we have tended, potentially in France, to simplify the issue as just a need to have European funding for defense capacity, and I don't think it's as simple as that. I think we need European defense funding, and I think we have an embryo of that with SAFE. We will definitely need more of it. We have an embryo of that with the current plan to build a reparation loan to Ukraine, but I think we will need more of that. But beyond having a common European funding, we will need an agreement on what is it that we want to do with this common European funding. And I think I agree with what was said earlier, that we need to identify a short list of priorities that are shared priorities and that we're prepared to fund in common. That will probably include communication systems that are independent from that of the US, reconnaissance and surveillance systems that are independent from that of the US, precision strike and long-range strike capacity, air defense, and maybe a drone force. I think you can agree on a list of 4 or 5 things that, are a shared priority and that we should put common funding towards. But once you've done that, you will need a European procurement system to deliver on that, because that cannot be procured on a purely national basis. And that will be a big change, both in France and in Germany, where there is an historical tendency for national defense spending to be a way of driving spending towards national defense champions. In order to do that, to have a European procurement, you probably also need to have some level of Europeanization of the supply side. So basically, the Europeanization of the industrial base, either by way of national champions like Rheinmetall becoming a European champion, which I think it's well on its way to become one, or kind of a state-led enterprise like Airbus, basically pulling together different national champions to turn them into a European champion. We've done it with Airbus a while ago. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to do it with defense. I think once we have that, so the unification of demand by a European procurement program and the unification of supply, we will need to have potentially discussions around arms export control. If we have created weapons in common, do we decide in common who do we export them to? This today is viewed as a very important national prerogative. I think that will need to become a European one. And last, and potentially not least, when we have all of this nice defense equipment, we'll probably need to decide in common how and when we want to use it. And so that's basically a stepping stone into a discussion around moving, common security and defense policy from a unanimous voting domain to potentially a qualified majority domain. So I'm just listing these items to illustrate that building a true European defense and security architecture is actually a project that is immensely political over and above finding the common funding for it. And I don't think we have had a serious enough conversation about that, in part because many countries, and I would probably put Germany as one of them, wants to believe that we are just living a short nightmare from which we are going to wake up. And when we wake up, we will have, a return to the good old transatlantic alliance, and we don't need to think so hard about building a European alternative. I think, we're not going to wake up from that nightmare and return to the good status quo ante. That status quo ante, I think, has disappeared. I had the impression after the Munich Security Conference speech by J.D. Vance that there had been a real awakening in Berlin and that there was a true and profound realization that we needed to forget the dreams of returning to the status quo ante. And I have the impression that also that speech is now viewed as a short nightmare that we may be able to wake up from. I think, if anything, I hope the national security strategy that we saw last week is a key, is showing that the nightmare is not over, and we need to prepare for it.
Daniela, our dependency on the US is not just when it comes to defense, but also when it comes to technology and networks. And one sentence that stuck with me from the Pariser Platz Dialogue last week was that someone said digital sovereignty means no one can accidentally or intentionally turn off our networks and our devices. And also drawing from the European Digital Sovereignty Summit a few weeks ago, what should be the EU priorities in this area to become more sovereign in the digital realm?
Thank you. I'll try and build a bridge between what Georgina and Shaheen have just said on defense and about the question of tech and digital sovereignty. Because I think we are risking to face the very same situation, that there is a high awareness now of risk. And Shaheen, I would say since Vance and the NSS, there is a very strong and thorough understanding that we have enormous dependencies on the US and on China in other ways. And we need to get out of that in a very carefully managed way. And yet it doesn't work. And why does it not work? Because we need a systemic answer. It doesn't work by just building another industrial project or by just finding a solution for a particular problem. But as Shaheen has laid out, it starts with the question, where do we raise the money? How do we define the priorities to spend the money? How do we then decide who delivers? Because all those questions are, of course, on the top level European questions, but they have repercussions for every single member state and hence domestic constituencies. But unless we manage to build up that system, I do not think that we will make that leap forward, which we need to make, because every euro spent now has to be spent in the most efficient way. And we are currently not doing that. And the same is true for the tech and digital agenda. Here again, we see dynamics. We see a very clear risk assessment. We now know that 80% of our digital procurement, be it hardware or software, comes from outside of the EU, with the US and China being the major providers. We want to catch up, but at the same time, it's not only about catching up, but it's also leapfrogging towards the next technology. What we have seen so far is that countries who have the fiscal space or who create it, like France, decide to invest in their own national catch-up process, both in terms of public money and then trying to mobilize private money alongside those flows. And that will definitely lead to suboptimal results because, again, just like in defense, there are economies of scale to be had. There is scalability of solutions is very, very relevant. The access to data can't be done by many small companies at the same time. You need to pool. You need to really go big on many issues. And unless Europe manages a systemic response, this won't happen because national interests will always play such a strong role that unless you have a real European logic, and just like Shaheen, I also think in the tech sector that begins with joint European public investment and then a framework to draw more private investment into promising projects. I think that's what we need. So right now we see efforts. In January, France hosted the first AI summit. Now there was a Franco-German initiative for a European digital sovereignty summit in Berlin. And just after that, another French summit on AI adoption, which became very practical, and that is very good. But those are just first steps. We really need a systematic response, which can get Europe as a whole over the very understandable but still short-term interests that national governments bring to the table.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. Just a very quick reminder to all the audience that you can ask your questions in the F&A, it's called because it's German Fragen- und Antwort box in Zoom. Maybe perhaps moving a bit away from these sectoral questions and looking ahead and on the more political circumstances. So the challenges in the different sectors are very similar as you laid out, Daniela and Shaheen, and so Georgina. We need to raise money, we need to decide, we need to have a very systematic approach to the challenges. At the same time, of course, the problems are not just external. We have rising polarization within the EU. We have Eurosceptic actors that are on the surge. And we have the French presidential elections in 2027 looming, with also, of course, the rise of the AfD in Germany. So also in France and Germany, very unstable domestic political circumstances. Can we, or how can the EU stay cohesive and actually take action on all of these areas that you have lined out with the difficult domestic instances that we have? And I just only laid out the situation in the member states. We, of course, also have the rather unstable European Parliament at this moment in time. How dire is on the political front in France, Germany, and the EU, in your view? And Daniela, I already have you on my screen. Perhaps you would like to start.
Okay. I think the situation is very serious because we have rising far-right support in key countries. If you look at Germany, we have AfD in some opinion polls outgrowing the Christian Democrats. And then if you look at the regional level, and we have a number of regional elections coming up, they may actually not only go first, but in some cases there is a potential that they gain an absolute majority. If that happens, there will be a strengthening of in Germany of AfD, but in other countries as well, of parties who take very critical stances on European cooperation and further European integration, or who even want to deconstruct part of the achievement. And I think we have to go into a very, very serious debate in two ways. One is, what is the price of deconstructing Europe just now, where we actually have external forces who announce, including the national security strategy of the United States, who announce that they are interested to work with players who want to weaken Europe as a political union or politically unified entity. Now, if that is not enough to know, I ask myself what else we need in terms of signaling to understand that we have a serious, not only economic and security situation, but also a serious political situation. Now, what needs to be done? So first of all, let's, all face the price of non-Europe, in particular in these times. Let's look very seriously at the alternative models that are being presented, because there is now a systemic conflict clearly there with Europe holding on to Western, mostly liberal democratic models, rule of law, some integration, and the creation of a space where conflicts are definitely played out in peaceful terms, where you have a legal framework that enables moderation between competing interests, where there's political decision-making on a supranational level. All this is a huge achievement for a continent that has gone through so many wars. And if that breaks up or gets more paralyzed than it is at the moment, Europe will simply not be able to face the global challenges that are out there. So I think that discussion of that price is important. And then we need to discuss, well, how can we get better and effective and sustain what we have? But of course, we also need to think very seriously about what are the reasons that citizens are so willing to cast votes, or at least to say in opinion polls, that they want to vote for parties which go beyond the consensus that has carried the European project and the democratic project in Europe for so many decades. So we need to understand the grievances. And then on a positive level, I think political leaders who face a very difficult time, fragmented parliaments, tensions within parliamentary groups, tensions within parties, external interference, a difficulty to even access citizens in a sphere of disinformation with what they think they want to communicate. So all this is complicating the democratic process. But what is also lacking is a very clear vision where policymakers want to take the EU, the economic model, the societal model, and after all, also the political model. So we are defending something, but we don't have a clear-cut future vision how this can be good and even better than it is today. And I believe there are so many positive things to say about Europe and so many visions that could be developed if we took the time to do it. So my argument will be at this point, let's look at all the problems, take them very seriously, understand what citizens' grievances are and how they can be drawn into the political process to give them a voice. But at the same time, be very clear, we have to strengthen our unity if we want to protect the European way of life. And last time I checked, the Russian or the Chinese one didn't seem particularly attractive to many Europeans.
Shaheen and Georgina, one of the big looming questions in all debates is, of course, what will happen to the European project and all of the European solutions that we need if there is a Bardella or Le Pen president coming in 2027. So from a French perspective, what will it mean? Perhaps you want to start, Shaheen.
Yeah.
What will we mean?
And I've also gone through the Q&A tab, so we have quite a few questions already in there. Okay. So maybe I'll try to answer one in passing. So I think it would be a real shock, maybe. But I think even before it arrives, I think it's already playing a role in both the Franco-German dynamic, but also in the European dynamic more broadly. I think, all of these issues that we've stressed, the need for defense integration, for fiscal integration, all the discussions around the EU budget are probably held hostage by the fact that there is a profound political uncertainty about what will happen in France. And if I can be honest, I think that uncertainty has increased even more in recent weeks and months, or since the snap elections called by President Macron. It was pretty clear on the whole for a long time that there was basically almost no candidate on the center left that could win against Le Pen or Bardella, as per the polls. But one could have been reassured by the fact that most candidates on the center right had a decent shot. And in particular, Edouard Philippe, who I think was the leading candidate on the center-right, was, up until this summer, not guaranteed, but had a strong chance of winning. I think there's been a very important change in the polls since the fall, essentially, since the autumn, which is that even Edouard Philippe, who is kind of the leading candidate on the right, is now losing in the second round versus Le Pen or Bardella. There is also an interesting dynamic, which is that Bardella and Le Pen, who were polling at about the same level, we now have a slight lead for Bardella. So Bardella could be actually a better candidate than Le Pen, which is somewhat surprising. So I think there's a high degree of uncertainty about the political outcome, but I think there is now less and less visibility about who is an alternative to the far right. The second point quickly is that I think there's some hope in many parts of Europe that a Le Pen or Bardella victory would result in some similar political outcome that we are seeing in Italy. So, I'm asked very often whether, in fact, Le Pen is going to be just another Meloni. And I think there are two reasons why this is not necessarily going to be the case. First, I think it's true to say that the RN has normalized a lot. So it's no longer arguing for leaving the EU, no longer arguing for leaving the euro, no longer arguing for bringing back the pension age to 60 years old. So I think there are meaningful changes and meaningful sort of, repositioning. That being said, I think there are two reasons why the relationship between France and the EU and France and Germany will be different than what it has been under Meloni in Italy. One is, I think this is a bit counterintuitive, I think France has weaker institutions than Italy and weaker checks and balances. Effectively, Meloni is forced to deal with a parliament. It's a true parliamentary democracy. It's forced to deal with a presidency that is a counterweight, and forced to deal with the EU and also with regional politics, because there are important regional governments at play. So that's the one thing that is different. The second, and maybe the most important thing, is that Italy needed and was about to receive almost 300 billion of EU funds when Meloni arrived in government. And therefore, she had a very strong incentive to behave in a pro-European way in order to receive these funds. France, on the contrary, will be a net contributor. And actually, probably the first fight between the next RN government, if there was to be one in the EU, would be on the EU budget, where France is likely to be facing a real need for fiscal consolidation at a time where potentially its contribution to the EU budget would have to increase. So I think that's going to be a point of friction. But I think France also has weaker checks and balances than Italy. It's a fully presidential system where the president essentially has all powers. It doesn't have a strong tradition of parliamentary checks and balances. And so as a result, we are going to not experience a lot of checks and balances from Parliament. That, to me, is the reason why we cannot be fully reassured that a Le Pen / Bardella presidency would be as smooth as what we've experienced with Italy for the time being.
Thank you. Georgina, let me throw in one final question for you also on this French presidential issue. I think when it comes to a possible French far-right president, but more generally speaking, far-right governments in the EU, there are two sort of lines of thoughts on different integration. One is we should do as much as possible in smaller groups to not be tied down by governments that don't want to move with us. The other one is we should actually do as much as we can in a supranational European setting to limit the options of those governments to break out, because it, of course, sets different constraints than intergovernmental pathways. So looking also towards what Shaheen has said and the outlook in France, perhaps you can tie into your assessment also this question: how do we go forward when it comes to coalitions of the willing or smaller groups of member states in the EU, which you have already mentioned as a solution?
Thank you. Can I just say I completely agree with what Shaheen has just said on what a Rassemblement National-led presidency would look like. And I think the importance of clarifying that being a French president versus the Italian prime minister is different in terms of leverage and power. The other question mark I have really is Meloni surrounded herself, all her EU advisors were the creme de la creme of diplomats in the Italian system who knew the EU inside out, right? Her European advisors, very good. The person she appointed as Italian permanent representative in Brussels has long dealt with the EU. So she also decided, she sort of realized that the EU was perhaps one of her weaker points of understanding and surrounded herself by people who really understood how to work the EU. It's not clear to me that the Rassemblement National would have the same approach at all. But what I do hear is, as Bardella is a very convincing politician. Like he's brought out a book, which as many French watchers know, that's like your first step into real credibility. And so he's brought out, I think it's even a second book about his sort of vision for France. And when you sort of listen off the hand, but not really concentrating on what he says things about industrial policy, which are quite interesting. He says things about energy policy, and more businesses are actually listening to what he has to say. And I think there is a willingness from the Rassemblement National to reach out to the business world, to beyond their voter base, to kind of understand some of the sort of constraints that they are facing. So I don't know what team they would have around them, I think matters a little bit as well, even though, as Shaheen said, the president has, of course, a lot of leeway. On your point about how do we deal with the far right, I mean, I really think that coalitions of groups of members is inevitable. And I think partly because you might not be able to go ahead just as a group of member states without having everyone on board, but you can certainly shape the discussion. And at the moment, if you think of 2017, Macron, the EU has never felt so French in many ways, whether it's on defence, on industrial policy. But yet today, and particularly since 2024, the dissolution of Parliament, France is very weak in terms of its leadership. And what's emanated from that is groups of member states that are really trying to drive the discussion that maybe by themselves, because they're not a big member state, can't fully lead the strategic discussion at the EU level. And so you're having little discussions and I think that is the way, frankly, that we have to go if we're going to respond in some capacity a bit faster. Because if we just expect to have these conversations at the EU level and every European Council meeting, especially we already, I think, have 14 centre-right/far right governments in the Council, that majority could even increase even further. And I think we can't afford to wait at EU decision levels every single time. The decision shaping has to happen outside of that. At the same time, I think there are ongoing discussions, and you've been writing about this, about how do we prevent a member state or two member states from blocking advancement. And I think that is a key decision Shaheen has written about as well. I think Daniela, these are genuine discussions that have to happen. And what are the red lines where we have to be willing to say, well, you can't we'll find a mechanism to avoid you blocking it. And if you do block it and it's really counter the majority EU interest, what are the repercussions and consequences of that? But I think on the decision shaping, which is really the problem we have now, is the EU is much more reactive than it is preventive, and that has to happen in smaller formats, I'm afraid.
So really the question of what is the price of not having Europe both for citizens and for government is abstract. Thank you, Shaheen, Georgina, and Daniela. I want to very briefly move to the questions that the audience asked, and we'll try to group them somewhat. And I think the first two questions are really about leadership and trust. So one question is about whether borrowing by the European Commission has contributed to declining trust in EU institutions among national governments. Is there a declining trust present in national governments when it comes to the EU institutions? And the other one is about the vacuum of leadership that you have mentioned, Georgina, and what steps can be taken to counter this? And is Merz someone who understands the moment and will rise to it?
So, Esther, shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So first of all, on opinion poll data and trust that citizens have I don't know any data that relates the spending of the EU to trust in the institutions. Maybe our colleagues have. But what I can say is we see very clearly, and there are no cross-country data, that citizens' trust in institutions and basically, to put it more colloquially, for the state or government to deliver is really low and going down in key EU member states, including in Germany. However, interestingly, this is not immediately translated into questioning of democracy as a system. However, I still see a risk and a link, because if citizens have the feeling the system doesn't work any longer, where the state kind of reaches me, it fails, like whatever, infrastructure doesn't work anymore, digitization hasn't worked, schools are not good anymore. All these day-to-day experiences, they build up a bad image. And that can then lead to an interpretation, also because we now have parties who really polarize against government and elites, that basically the trust of citizens is pushed down even further. And now for that question of money, I think we now have a unique opportunity, and I'm speaking for the German case here, because the government now has created, but not the government, the previous parliament actually created fiscal space for this government to spend on investment infrastructure, for instance, and also on defense, without necessarily cutting into social policy and other things. And this is the momentum I think we have to seize by both spending smartly, implementing some reforms, and creating a real new dynamic to show that modernization is possible and that the state can actually deliver and better than it has done before. So I think there is a link between, sums of money put onto the table, and then how does it at the end look in terms of how valid, how reasonable was that investment. But for the European level, I unfortunately haven't seen any data, so I cannot respond to that. Now, for the question of leadership, I'll pick that up too, because there was a question, a German dimension in the question. And that is, interestingly, Friedrich Merz, when he got elected, on that same evening, he went on public TV, as they do, in that first big talk show where all the leaders come together of the different parties. And he said very clearly that an era has ended, that transatlantic relations aren't what they used to be, and that Europe has to take things into their hands, and that Germany has a role to play. Now, since then, I would not say that there is a lack of general commitment. I think the strategic insight is there. However, what we don't see at the moment is an agenda also between Germany and France, where for the sake of European progress, either government is really willing to compromise on something to get things done and move things forward. And Europe only works by compromise. So you can never have it all, in particular, not in a crisis situation, which we are currently in. And this, this momentum, I think, needs to come soon, because otherwise, I don't think there will be major progress. There are many, many important compromises to be struck, be it on the way or whether we spend money together in the European Union, how we set that up, what the priorities are, how we balance a new relationship between government and the state and the economy, because there again, France and Germany traditionally come from quite different positions. And it doesn't help to have that competition within the EU necessarily, but to really rethink how we shape the European economic framework in a new way, including competition policy, as was said, including deepening the financial market. So all these things, we see bits and pieces that the discussion is happening between Paris and Berlin, but I have not seen traces of a compromise package that is encompassing and really allows a leap forward quite yet.
Thank you, Daniela. Perhaps the next question is for you, Georgina. You can, of course, also respond to the leadership question, but the next one is, how much damage has the exclusion of the UK from SAFE done to European defense ambitions? In general, how do you see the future of the UK with regards to Europe?
The self-exclusion.
The self-exclusion. Thank you, Shane, for the reminder. Look, how bad is it that the UK still hasn't been admitted to SAFE? Materially, honestly, it doesn't, I think, make a huge difference. Like the UK, if it hasn't, the EU hasn't accepted the EU, industry can still take part from, I think, up to to 30%. It wouldn't be as high in terms of bidding for EU money and contracts, but you can still participate. And, UK defence industry is still active in Europe. But I think politically, it sends a very bad signal for two reasons. First, the reset. The British, the Labour government is very different to the previous Tory governments. I think part of the problem is that they think that because they're Labour, they'll get an easier ride inside the EU, and that's obviously not that's misunderstanding the EU. But nonetheless, they received this kind of answer, and the minister in charge said, "Look, this will not hold back the reset. We're still very serious about it." But of course, behind closed doors, there's extreme disappointment. And there's a sense that we are really trying to reset. This is really important. It would send a political signal. And yet the EU blocks us out of it and actually doesn't really give a satisfactory answer to our questions, which is, why is the price tag? Because that seems to be the biggest issue, that the EU wants the UK to contribute large amounts of taxpayers' money to participate in it. And when the UK has said, can you give me a breakdown of that number? The EU's basically founded and not been able to give an account. And so behind closed doors, there is a sense that this does actually not damage the reset, but it certainly is it's not a great day for the reset. So I think politically that matters. And I think also geopolitically, if we're talking about Europe doing more for its security and defense, what signal are we sending that actually we can't in a way negotiate a European country, of course non-EU, but European country participation in a new EU defence programme? I just don't think it's great. I don't know if the US and Russia are really following that closely, the negotiations of UK access to SAFE. But nonetheless, I think the political signalling matters. Of course, I understand that there are multiple reasons why the EU is responding the way that it has. The UK is simply not a priority. London forgets this, but in the long list of when has the UK really come up in conversation so far in the hour that we've had, very little. There are lots of other things going on. I think the EU is afraid of being locked into an agreement with the UK that could have a very different leadership in a few years' time. I think the EU is also expecting the UK to fully implement the existing deals, and it hasn't done that. So there's a sense of, you need to deliver first, and then we can see what more baubles we can put to the Christmas tree. And then I think the power vacuum is obviously a problem, because France, for example, is really not paying that much attention to this, but they are the major blocker, I think, or one of the major blockers to UK accessing SAFE. And I think that's also because there's a little bit of a breakdown in command between Paris and Brussels, and it's much more difficult to compromise when you are focused on other things. And I think that political vacuum is not helping either. But I think the fallback of this is the way the EU's always done things, and we're scared of offering something to a third country that others might ask. If you're negotiating a safe agreement with Canada, you really should be able to negotiate one with the UK. And so, as much as I've been throughout the Brexit negotiations quite hard on the UK's negotiating position, and often thought the UK thought it would get a better deal because it's a security guarantor, etc., I think in this case, the EU, if it really is to oppose the UK's participation, has to have a much clearer answer as to why it is opposing it. Is it really that it's afraid to be locked into something? In which case, can we not have a break clause in the agreement? Those exist. If it's a numbers thing, then I think the EU has to be better at explaining why the number is as high as it's proposing.
Thank you, Georgina. Shaheen, the next question is for you on the future of the next generation weapon systems. I think it's the abbreviation. As possible German policy changes were mentioned, how do you assess then the future of this project from both the German and the French perspective?
Sorry, I didn't hear which project.
Next generation weapon system.
Okay. I think it's hard to say, but to me, there's no future for neither the FCAS nor the main battleground system. I think both are in fact projects that we cannot say officially, but I think, in effect, been abandoned. I think that doesn't mean that there's no space for Franco-German defense cooperation. I think there is an enormous amount of space in areas that have been opened by Germany. And I'm thinking about the European Sky Shield, which I think worryingly has been decided to be based on almost entirely non-European technology. I think, building a European indigenous air defense system, that is entirely dominated by US and Israeli technology is, I think, a bit problematic. I think there's an area of cooperation there. And there is, importantly, an area of cooperation that's been identified both by the Chancellor and by the President, and which, since the election, we haven't seen a lot of progress on, which is the question of nuclear deterrence. Actually, DGAP has conducted a poll over the last year over Germans' attitudes towards nuclear deterrence, and it's very striking to see a very profound and rapid evolution, whereby basically Germans are now, at 80% favorable to a joint Franco-German nuclear deterrence umbrella. And so I think that's a very important shift, which I hope the French and the German governments can work on, potentially also with the British government. And that might be an area where a reset is more likely. Maybe a quick reaction to Georgina. I think, things work the other way around. The British government proposed a number for participating in the SAFE project in the hundreds of millions of euros, when, by any measure, you would at least be, an order of magnitude higher, whether you go by the size of the defense industry of the UK, the size of the defense spending, or the size of GDP, whichever measure you want to take. And maybe the EU didn't have a good way of explaining its 5+ billion contribution demand. But, in any event, we would not be, in the hundreds of millions that the British government was proposing. Maybe a last word, even though I saw that the person asking the question has left the chat. The question was asked about how I think the term used was reckless borrowing by the European Commission had undermined confidence in the EU institutions. And I think both are actually factually inaccurate. There is no such thing as reckless borrowing by the European Commission. There has been large borrowing by the European Commission as part of the NGEU program. I think most people would agree today to say that the assessment of that borrowing has been extraordinarily effective at dealing with the fallout of the COVID crisis, both in terms of public health as well as in terms of macroeconomic consequences. So I don't think anybody would use the word reckless to qualify this amount of borrowing. And second, actually, there is some data about confidence in EU institutions and the European Commission, and there's actually a long history of that data with the Eurobarometer. There hasn't been a meaningful decline of confidence in EU institutions since that borrowing. So I think that, that's a way of putting this issue to rest. It's wrong to say that EU borrowing is undermining confidence in EU institutions. In fact, there's been no decline in confidence in EU institutions. There's been some decline, however, in confidence in national governments. But in fact, the difference between confidence in EU government and national government is actually increasingly striking. Historically, Southern European countries had little confidence in their national governments and high confidence in European governments. And it was the reverse in Northern Europe, and in particular in Germany. And I think what's interesting is that now you have a decline in confidence in national governments, including in Germany, but you still have quite a high level of confidence in European government.
Thank you, Shaheen. Let me do one very final round of final statements, tying it to two of the questions that we have. And it's really, are we just going through a difficult time? And it will end when the EU is capable of defending itself. And what will it take for national elites in France and Germany to accept that separate national economic, military, and digital strategies are simply insufficient to counter the disruptions by current leaders of the USA, Russia, and China? And I would ask you to just maybe make a very brief final comment relying on or sort of relating to these questions, and then we will come to an end. Shaheen, would you like to start?
Yes, so I think Europe is used to, go through these crises that each time appear existential, and I think each time it is proving that it can respond to them. It is sadly always responding to them a bit too slowly and a bit, imperfectly. But I think it, tend to come out stronger from each of these shocks and crises. And I think this time will be no different. I would, highlight one thing and I don't want to sound complacent, but I think there's one important change about Europe politics over the last decade, is that even though we have very serious external threats, I'm thinking about Russia, but I'm also thinking about the way the US is perceiving now the EU as an hostile continent, or rather the way the US is turning into an hostile continent towards the EU. But domestically, we have these fears about the AfD in Germany, about the RN in France. But what has happened over the last decade is that none of these parties are now truly anti-European parties, in the sense that they have as a political project the destruction of the EU. They have all become, anti-immigration party in defense of a certain view of, of white and Christian Europe. But they no longer really fight for the demise of the EU. In fact, they believe that they can further their agenda by way of the EU. And I think that changes a lot the sort of threats from within that Europe was living through over the last decade. A decade ago, the AfD was a party that wanted to break the euro down. A decade ago, the RN wanted to leave the EU as well as the euro. I think all of that has gone out the window, and now we're dealing with parties that have a political project about Europe that may be different from some of our project, but I think is still, in a way, a project that requires the EU to sustain itself. And I think that's, in my view, a very important political change that makes Europe politically maybe a bit more stable than it would have been a decade ago.
Daniela, some final remarks?
Yes, so I think for your question, are we witnessing a crisis that goes away? We are witnessing a systemic crisis. So the whole order question, which I laid out in my first comment, I think that is really the design task we have. So we have to redesign the security order. We have to design a new economic and social model that survives in a good way under new conditions of very rapid technological development, very strong systemic global competition, and a new wave of protectionism that or economic statecraft that is used against Europe. So that is the task. Is that possible? I think it still is. However, it will take, and that was your question, what does it take to get people realize how big the task is? I think it will take a lot of public pressure, but in a positive sense of support and showing that a way forward is possible. What we have seen over the past month is that, for instance, companies, when they speak about Europe, they become very critical because they are criticizing overregulation in their view, or bureaucracy, and all of these things that in their day-to-day work, gets on their nerves. But what we need is a real realization that Europe is a value to the way we have designed our economy, to the way we have designed and developed our democracy, and the way we need to redefine security. So we have to be careful. We must be able to criticize the current system because it's no longer working as well as it did, without being anti-European. And I think that's where now much more voices and much more ideas are needed, because policymakers are navigating an environment where pretty often also polarization between member states plays a role, where they have to defend themselves, for instance, for putting money on the table for a European cause. All these things are picked up. And so I believe we have to counterbalance that by a very constructive push for future debate on the EU.
Thank you, Daniela. Georgina, you have the last word.
Oh, thank you. Just a point, basically picking up on what Shaheen and Daniela have just said. The EU has been able to get through multiple crises, Brexit, COVID. Every time people were like, EU will never get through it, it did. But I think, as Daniela said, it is systemic, and so it's going to last a while longer than many people would hope. I think there are two things that we need to get right, and we've talked about in this discussion. Obviously, the defense side, we just need to be more capable security actors, and we need to be able to basically police what's going on in our backyard without always relying heavily on the United States. And the second is we really need to get our economy in order, and we need to be much more competitive. Because one thing that really strikes me in conversations with the US, and I'm not saying we should take what Americans think of Europe as, as our guiding light, but when you're in Washington, there is a bipartisan view on three things, right? The first is, of course, Europe is too dependent on US security guarantees. It annoys them. Second is that Europeans sap up all their time. And this is Democrats saying it as much as Republicans. Like every European ambassador that they see comes with a long list of things that they want done. It's just not sustainable. Instead of going with, these are all the things we're doing, and we'll have one thing that we're asking from you. So I think that the frustration level is really real. And the third is a growing number of Americans just think that we're economically stagnating and not interesting. And there are Asian countries as well that think that we're just, and how many times have we heard a beautiful old continent with museums and nice handbags, and that's about it. And I think we need to get much more serious about how we unlock investment, all the things that we've discussed today. And I think that would put us in a much better place. Finally, on the politics, internal politics, the far right is really setting a lot of the terms of the debate on the EU. And so when Daniela earlier said, we also need to be talking about the virtues of the EU, what we get out of the EU, what would Europe look like without the EU? I think this is genuinely important, and also moving away from letting the far right consistently set the terms of the European debate. Because until now, the linkages between far right parties in Europe has been quite weak, but they are growing links. And I saw that Jordan Bardella met Nigel Farage today. Now, of course, the UK is no longer a member of the EU, it's self-excluded itself, but there are coalitions and partnerships that are being built between the far right. They do not agree on anything. I think the MAGA movement think that the far right in Europe are aligned politically and socially with them. I would say socially and ideologically, maybe, politically, certainly not. But there's a lot of misconceptions, but things are happening. And so if you don't support the far right, then you really need to get much better at selling your vision for the EU. So I think that would be a good start.
Perfect. Thank you, Georgina. Thank you, Georgina, Shaheen, and Daniela, for your excellent insights today. I think this was quite the whirlwind tour of many topics that Europe is facing, but I think we have also gathered quite a few proposals for solutions going forward, with perhaps positive visions for the European Union being one of the bigger ones. So thank you very much for being with us on this very last event of the Pariser Platz Dialogue, to all three speakers, and of course also the audience in the online room today.
Thank you too for having us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.